the basic idea that science is somehow at odds with the idea of God is at the heart of the West. It's a terrible idea. You've spent much of your life debunking this really silly, embarrassing idea that many people hold. A figure comes to mind I thought we might talk about for a moment, Dr. Stephen Hawking. I want to start with him because here's a man who seems to insist that the idea of God is inconsistent with science and reason. It's hard for me to believe that someone of that intellect would not see the deep problems with his position.
It is very difficult because of the fact that Newton, who was arguably the brightest scientist who ever lived and who held the Lucasian chair, he believed in God. And the irony of the two of them, and I've often thought about this, is Newton believed in God, and one of his reasons that supported that faith in God was his discoveries in science, including the law of gravity. And when he discovered the law of gravity, he didn't say, now I can explain it scientifically, I don't need God. No. What he did was write the most brilliant book in the history of science, the Principia Mathematica. And at the front of it, he explicitly said, I hope this persuades thinking people to believe in a deity. So instead of saying, I've discovered the law of gravity, I don't need God, he said, what a brilliant God that did it that way.
I mean, he actually wrote that in the Principia Mathematica.
That's
I didn't
correct.
know that. That's rather
correct.
amazing.
He really sensed that there was a pathway here to God through his scientific discovery. And then the centuries go by and we come to Stephen Hawking, who in his bestseller, A Brief History of Time, which they say is the most unread book in history.
That is correct.
Because
everybody's
got it, and everybody gets to about page 4. I've read it all, actually. But he left space for God at the end. And there's the famous statement, if we had a unifying theory of everything, which means a scientific theory to unify the 4 basic forces of nature, we would know the mind of God. But in a much more recent bestseller, which is called The Grand Design, and that's a very interesting title for him to use, which he co-authored with Leonard Mlodinow, who's the physicist behind the Star Wars films.
Excuse me, there's a physicist behind the Star Wars films?
Well, there was a physics advisors apparently behind that, but I don't want to go into that.
No, and I don't want you to go into that.
Okay, but having said that, let me say that I remember Stephen Hawking. He was at Cambridge just ahead of me, and he was just beginning to walk with a stick and a limp. He developed motor neuron disease, and of course his whole story, he's the most famous living scientist, is a story of immense courage against supreme odds. And I have no doubt that he's a genius. He's light years ahead of me in his mathematical ability. What I query is his use of science to suggest to people that they have to choose between science and God. Now, the thing that really captivated my mind with him was I was sent a pre-production part of his book, The Grand Design.
Which just came out a few years ago.
Yes, and it contained this, which is his central argument. And it has to do with gravity. And it said this, because there is a law of gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing.
Because there's a law of gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing.
Now, when I read that, I thought, come again? And I read it again, then I wrote a book about it. Because I could see almost immediately where the problem lies. So I read through Hawking's book. Now, Hawking has got huge influence because of his status. In this book, he now comes out as an atheist.
Yeah.
And this is his main reason. It's ironic. Newton says gravity is a wonderful evidence, among many others, of God. Hawking says this is the evidence that there isn't a God. We don't need God. And I thought, what is going on here? What are this man's reasons for not believing in God? Now, up until shortly before that, I had thought that many of these people, their problem was a failure to understand the nature of science. I still hold that view. But what suddenly dawned on me, there's another huge reason why they say you've got to choose between science and God. And that's because they've got a false idea of God.
A false idea of God. How so?
Of God, yes. Because Hawking starts off by talking about the Greek gods. And we got to get rid of those before we can do science. And I agree with him.
Yeah.
If you think that the moon is a god, you won't study it because you might upset the god. And in that sense, science has done a good job of getting rid of those gods.
Yeah.
Now, when you think of those gods, what are they? They're what we now call today, technically, gods of the gaps. I don't understand lightning, so I say it's a god. So the word God is for an unknown X that explains lightning. But once I do a course on astrophysics in Oxford or somewhere else, God just disappears.
So
that
they
God
posit-
disappears.
So God, according to their false definition, the very idea of God pushes out reason, and once reason comes in, God disappears.
That's exactly right. Now, what I suddenly realized is this. They currently place the God of the Bible in the category of a Greek God. And I was up against Michael Shermer. I don't know whether you've ever come across Michael Shermer.
I know of him.
Editor, Skeptic magazine, in a debate in Oxford. And I think it was he. There were three people against three of us, you see. And he looked at me and said, "You are an atheist."
He said that you're an atheist.
I'm an atheist, and I knew what was coming, of course. "You are an atheist with respect to Zeus, Artemis, Baal," and he went on far too long because I know most of these gods. I'd come across them before. And then he said with a great grin, "We just go one God further, and we reject Jehovah, the God of the Bible." And I thought, how ignorant can a person be of the ancient gods? Because if you've done any thinking at all and read anything, which I have because I'm very interested in the ancient gods, they're the background to my book on Daniel, and they're very similar, but it's a different story.
Is your book on Daniel out?
Oh, yes.
What's the name of that?
Against the Flow.
Against the Flow.
Yes.
And you've just reminded me, forgive me for interrupting, but your website
Is johnlennox.org.
.org.
Yes, and there's a lot of stuff on Veritas, a huge
Yeah.
amount, about 60 lectures I've given in the US,
Okay, great.
debates, and so on and so forth. I'm very interested in the ancient gods. And the common characteristic they have is, in all those ancient mythologies, they have a cosmogony, yes, but they also have a theogony. And a theogony is the genesis of the gods.
Yeah.
Because the gods appeared from the primeval stuff of the universe. In other words, they're material gods.
Now again and again I have to hit pause because that's a big idea.
Oh,
it has not occurred to most people that if the gods of the ancient world, and I'm familiar with some of these creation myths, they came out of something, so you say therefore they are material
That's
gods.
right. Let me put it
an
this way.
extraordinary point.
The world expert probably on this topic was a man called Werner Jaeger, who's a professor at Oxford, and he puts it this way. In the ancient Near East, the gods are descended from the heavens and earth. The God of the Bible created the heavens and earth. Now that's the difference. The God of the Bible doesn't belong to the category of those gods in any sense.
Right.
But the mistake they're making, and Hawking's making, is imagine that we think the God of the Bible is a God of the gaps. He's just put there to explain until we get a scientific explanation. then it dawned on me, if you believe that God's like that, you have to choose between God and science.
Yeah.
Why? Because that's the way you've defined God. You've defined God to be a non-explanation waiting for science to come along. So of course you have to choose. The God of the Bible is not a God of the gaps. And I often say to people, have you ever read the first line of the Bible? It goes like this. In the beginning, God created the bits of the universe we don't yet understand. And they all laugh, as you do, politely, thank you very much. That's nonsense. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, which is grammatically a merism. Everything he created. The bits you do understand and the bits you don't. Moreover, think about ordinary life. The more I understand about art, the more I admire the genius of a Rembrandt, not the less. The more I understand of engineering, the more I admire the genius of a Henry Ford, not the less. And going up to the universe, the more I understand of the universe, the more I admire. This is Newton, the God who did it that way.
Okay, and this reminds me of C.S. Lewis, and by the way, I don't want to forget to say that you were a student of C.S. Lewis.
No, I listened to some of his lectures.
Close enough.
Okay.
You saw him lecture?
I'll accept that American definition.
You listened to some of his lectures?
I did. I listened to the last lectures he ever gave at Cambridge in 1962.
That means that you were a student of his, whether you know it or not. In the loose sense.
I wasn't registered in the English faculty to study medieval and Renaissance literature.
We don't care.
But I'd studied it anyway.
But I guess it brings up Lewis because Lewis's literature, his fiction, in some ways shines a light on theology and understanding in a way that I've never seen before. It's as though these scientific materialists are positing a finite reality and therefore have a zero-sum game view, such that rather than one thing increasing everything, or two things increasing each other, having this mutual compatibility that is glorious and leads to infinity, they are making it sound as though it's a zero-sum game, and we explain things and explain things and explain things, and the more we explain things, the more we push out God. Because they believe in a finite universe, and they believe that that's all there is, they have this worldview in a sense. And the God of the Bible is infinite, is eternal. In other words, these are ideas that are incompatible with a material worldview. I'm saying too much in it, so feel free to respond or not respond. But it strikes me as you're talking about this that I just hadn't thought of that before, that they have a very, very limited zero-sum game view of the universe.
Well, that's true, but what we're saying here is that they do not understand the biblical concept of God. See, Richard Dawkins, he says in one of his books that you've got scientific explanation, you've got the God explanation. They're both scientific type explanations.
Right.
That, to my mind, is profound misunderstanding. The God explanation is not even in the same category as the scientific explanation, and I'm going to move to that. And I said to him, much to his irritation actually on one occasion, the God you don't believe in, I don't believe in either. You know, you're tilting at a windmill, you see. And Richard Dawkins, he shows it, he reveals it in The God Delusion, where he says, and here's one of his main arguments. I couldn't believe it. I just could not believe it. If you say God created all this, you're going to have to ask who created God. And that's nonsense. And it is nonsense, but not in the way he thought. Because if you ask who created God, you're assuming God is created. Well, I don't believe in a created God. We usually call them idols, and we don't need Dawkins to tell us they don't exist. You see, he's not addressing even the question if there's an eternal God. The Bible claims God is eternal. He's not created. So his question doesn't even apply, as I pointed out to him in that debate. But then I got the sting in the tail. I said, you believe the universe created you, don't you? So let me ask you your question, which you think is valid. Who created your creator? I'm still waiting for an answer, and that's 10 years ago.
Well, it's funny because when you talk about somebody saying, well, who created God, they're still staying inside the time-space cosmos. In other words, that we say that God created time and space, and so causality is in that idea that if God created something, who created God? But that's still inside the creation.
But it's actually logically very silly. I mean, I used to get it in Russia, and it used to be very funny. They'd ask me this question, or children would ask it in Britain. I never heard it from professors. But in Russia, they'd say this, and I'd say to them, these were the old days, when I used to go. They'd tell me, I'd say, what do you believe about the universe? They'd say it's eternal. Oh, I said, isn't that interesting? You believe in an eternal universe, and yet your question, who created God, shows you cannot conceive of an eternal God. Why is that? How can you conceive of an eternal universe, not an eternal God? It's just totally inconsistent. I said, your problem is you can't even think there might be an eternal reality that is a person.
If you think these conversations are valuable, would you do us a favor and please like this video and subscribe to this channel? When you do that, you help us get these conversations out to a wider audience by telling YouTube that people are interested in this. Also, you can go to socratesinthecity.com, sign up for our newsletter, and you can check back every week. There's new stuff here every week. Thank you for tuning in.